Okay, my name's Chuck Seitz, and I was engineer at King from 1959 to 1964. The last 3 years I was chief engineer, and I got in on a lot of interesting things there. I learned a whole lot there, and tell you the truth, I'm a fairly old man, and I've forgotten way too much of the good times I had there and what I learned and so on. After I left King Records in '64, I went to RCA Records in Nashville, and I was engineer there until I retired in 1977. Before I went to King, I was really introduced to the recording process by getting demos made from my songs. I was an amateur, wanting to be a pro songwriter. Did my demos in a little studio out in Northside here in Cincinnati, where I could get 3 or 4 songs recorded and put on 78 RPM discs for about $5–10, something like that, something I could really afford. There was a real good studio downtown at that particular time. This was back about 1944, 45, something like that. Herzog Studios is downtown, and but I couldn't afford them. They were high class. Herzog's was where Patty Page recorded Tennessee Waltz, and Hank Williams recorded a whole bunch of his songs down there. So Flatt and Scruggs recorded down there. Well, when I recorded out at this little studio, this little cheap studio, the engineer was it wasn't to my liking, let's put it that way. And one time I said, let me mix the board when I only had 4 microphones out there, but I had a fiddle and a mandolin and a bass and a vocal and rhythm guitar. And to blend it properly, it sounds easy, but the way he did it, it didn't turn out too good. At any rate, I started doing it out there, and to make a long story short, I went to work out there and worked there 6 years in that recording studio, and I had pretty good clientele. All the guys up and down Vine Street knew me, and I even recorded one of them enough times that he got on MGM records, and that helped my ego and as well as my bankroll. At any rate, Eddie Smith, who was the chief engineer at King, heard of me and came over and talked to me, and he said, would you like to work at King? And I says, well, hell yes. And never really thought a whole lot of it. One other time I got a new cutter head for my lathe there at Gateway Records, and Eddie heard about that, and he wanted to come over. He brought a couple of tapes over to King, over to my studio from King, and wanted to see how that cutter head worked on his tapes, and it was pretty good, so I understand he ordered one. But it was my friendship with Eddie Smith that eventually got me to come to work for King. I started out working part-time, so working nights and weekends. And then all of a sudden, Eddie Smith up and left and went to New York. And I went to work there full-time. Well, King was pretty well organized by that time. The orders for the studio came from upstairs. They wanted a new album. They'd give me the songs to put in the album, and what you'd have to assemble the thing, and in some cases remix it to make it work as as part of the album sound. And we had quite a bit of outside work that came in, customers that hired King Records to sell them 1,000 records or so, and they'd just send in a tape and we'd have to master that. And the day when I first started there full time would go from like 8:30 in the morning until 6 at night, and then we had a few part-time engineers that worked at night and in cleaning up stuff and whatever. Well, I don't know. I recorded when I came there. I came there as an experienced engineer of country music, but it wasn't all I liked. In my own record collection, I had a lot of pop stuff and R&B stuff. It used to even be called race stuff, and it didn't take long to learn that recording was recording, and that the sound of the recording that came from the mixing board was okayed and directed by the A&R man who was sitting right beside you, and so it didn't take long to merge black music with country music as far as I was concerned. I personally was a country person myself. I wrote country songs and recorded country songs and everything before I got there, but it didn't take long to cross over. You learn all the time. Every time you make a good record and get complimented on it, well, you put that in your bank and keep it there. Well, Gene Redd was a good A&R man. He was a good musician, and although he had he had the reputation of being Sid's whipping boy, he got fired about 5 times while I was there because he made Sid mad, and he always hired him back. But so he was so good that at what he did, he picked songs and knew what they should sound like, and this and that and the other. I'd have to say that between him and, I can't think of his name, I'm sorry, the piano player, he was head of the Chicago where the distributorship. He was head of the Chicago distributorship, but he spent a lot of time in Cincinnati. Well, one of the first was Hank Ballard, and I worked. I wish I had a list. I worked little. Of course, the biggest recording star there was James Brown. I did quite a number of James Brown sessions. And
I saw in the notes that you produced or edited the Live at the Apollo album.
Yes.
And what was that like? Because that was like one of the first live records that Sid thought he was completely crazy to want to do that.
Sid didn't want to do that album at all. Number one, it was going to be expensive, and number two, he didn't have the confidence that a live album was viable, so James Brown, is according to the story that I heard, paid for it all himself. He booked the Apollo, rented it, and rented a recording studio engineer to come in and record it on 2-track, because it had to go on 2-track. It wasn't stereo, it was 2-track. It had James Brown's voice on one track and everything else over on the other track. And when it got back to Cincinnati, it was quite long. As you know, a vinyl album in those days, about the longest you could really do it would be about 26 or 28 minutes. And so on both sides, that made it less than an hour that you could do this. And he put on a fairly long show, about an hour and a half show. So a lot of it was edited out, and it was my job to get it down to a usable level. And after we did the editing, Hal Neely was the general manager, and he helped out a lot. But we got it down to a usable level, which is under an hour for the show. And he said to me one day, he said, "What do you think of this album?" And I said, "Well, Hal, I don't claim to be any expert, but I said, this is supposed to be a live album, supposed to be exciting." I said, "It isn't exciting at all." I said, "Number one, the guy that recorded it at the Apollo Theater, he didn't mic the crowd. All he got was what was up on the stage, and a little of the crowd leaked in, you know what I'm saying? But the crowd makes it exciting a lot of times. It makes the record sometimes." So Neely says, "Well, what could we do for it?" And I thought about it maybe a day or two, and I knew a DJ in Cincinnati that had sock hops, and he had a sock hop every Thursday or Friday for high school, young college kids at a place out in Roselawn where they had big band shows, and he'd go out there and he'd play records for these kids, and he'd get several hundred kids out there, and they'd dance to the music he played them. Well, I got a hold of him, and he says, "Yeah, come on." He says, "We'll make you some applause, and we'll get you some excitement." So I took a 2-track recorder out there and got all kinds, all lengths, and all this and that and the other. And to make a long story short, we worked for quite a long time in taking the original master that had been edited down to what we wanted for the album, and we inserted the applause all through that album and really made it interesting.
That's
As kids,
awesome.
Well, no. I'm not ashamed that I did it, because actually that was my job. In recording today, you record on a whole bunch of tracks. A normal recording machine has got 24 tracks, and each musician and so on goes on a different track. And you can even take one off and put him back on the way you want him, and so on. In other words, you could build excitement by the fact that you've got all this to work with. In those days, we had 2 tracks. One of them had the vocalist's voice on it, and the other had the band on it, which you couldn't change. And if anything leaked in, you had to use it. You couldn't even get rid of it. So I'm not ashamed that I worked on that thing. As a matter of fact, I've had an awful lot of compliments on it, and one time I saw James in Nashville. He was down there for a concert out at the whatever, and he pulled his bus rather, up behind the stage, and I went back and visited with him for a while. And he said, "Hey," he said, "our record, our Apollo record has gone gold." And I said, "Well, that's great. It's great." In the back of my mind, I said, "Boy, I wish I'd had a gold record out of that deal." And I evidently told him that. And he says, "Well," he says, "I'll see that you got one." But I never did. I'd love to have one. Incidentally, on my walls in my media room, I've got about 25 gold records there now. But none of them came from King.